Wondering how your mindset affects your life? How to bring more energy into your business and life? Millions of people around the world ask these same questions daily. You are in the right place. Learn practices that will help give your life the meaning and success you've been searching for. Welcome to the Charge Podcast, teaching you how to create habits around real goals every day. Practical life advice from those who made it. Here's your host, Gary Wilbers.
Welcome, Chargers. We're glad you're back again this week for another great podcast. We're so excited that you come back each and every week. Our goal on this podcast is to bring different guests with different viewpoints so you can really decide what you want to take action on. And this week, I think we found you a great guest that you're going to get some insight on leadership, but you're going to get some insight on just pure life. And Roderic Yapp is an experienced speaker, facilitator, and coach who specializes in developing leaders by changing the way people think and behave. He's a former Royal Marines officer. Yapp was fortunate enough to lead Marines on operations around the world. The highlights of his career include leading 30 Royal Marines in the combat on the front line in Afghanistan and the evacuation of civilians from Libya during the Arab Spring. Roderic also led recapture of the 55,000-ton MV Montecristo from the pirate control back in 2011 as part of a Nato counter-piracy task force off the Somali coast. Roderic joined the Urenco Group in 2012, where he was responsible for coaching and developing leaders using operational excellence model. In 2015, he founded Leadership Forces, which focuses on developing leaders within organizations. His clients include HSBC, Deloitte, Jaguar, Land Rover, Royce, and Nato. Wow, Roderic, you've done a lot of great things. We are so excited you decided to join us on the Charge Podcast.
No, happy to be here, Gary, and thank you for such a generous introduction.
Well, thank you for joining us. I love getting different guests, and we're going to get into your history and kind of your belief in leadership. And I love what you talk about, changing the way people think and behave. But before we do, the podcast is called the Charge Podcast because that's a mantra of mine. Create habits around real goals every day. Would you share with me a habit or a couple habits that you have that you think's led to success in your life?
So I think the most powerful one that I've adopted in the last sort of few years is the habit of taking in good, high quality information and content. And the way I explain this to people is it's kind of a bit like an information diet. The quality of the material you read, if it's high quality, decent, well thought out, carefully put together content, the sort of stuff that you might get off The Economist or various podcasts like this, that has an impact on how you think. And I think that a lot of people will say to you, I don't have the time to read. I don't have the time to do those kind of things. And it's like, well, just have a look at what are the materials that you do take on board? What are the sort of newspapers that you do read? Because you only read a newspaper for a sort of few moments at a time. And I found that if you can increase the quality of that, and if you can create that or turn that sort of into a daily habit as part of a commute or a walk or as part of your exercise regime, it starts to have a compound interest effect. And over the course of months, weeks, years, that really starts to add up. And there are things that I now think about where I'm like thinking, where did I get that piece of information from, or that anecdote or that story? And I think what you find is that if you start doing that regularly over the course of months, years, it starts to add up, and it really helps the way you think and behave. So I found that the most valuable thing.
Well, I think you're so right on that. And that's part of the reason I say it's about small habits. Really, each day allows us to get that charge, allows us to really accomplish what we want. And you've done a lot in the leadership area, and there's so many different ways that I could go here, but I think I'll start with your experience with the Royal Marines. What did that teach you about leadership?
Oh, I mean, so much. If I could narrow it down to sort of a couple of lessons, one of the first commanders I worked for, my first company commander, he had this sort of mantra, which was basically look after the men, everything else will take care of itself. And the more I internalized that, and sort of the more I've kind of thought about it, and the way I translate that into the sort of civilian world is the customer of the leader is the team. They are your priority, your number one priority. Everything else, doing the work, writing the reports, doing the other stuff is secondary to the performance of those individuals. Because if you can help all of your team members improve by 5 or 10%, that has a cumulative impact that you can't do on your own. So they are your customer. They are your number one priority. So the second thing I learned was from a former commanding officer, a guy called Charlie Stickland. And he taught me the lesson that you should trust your intuition, trust your spidey sense. When something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. You just need to go and prove it to yourself later. And I found that to be really, really helpful. I think in the modern era, more and more people are leaning towards using data to help support their decision-making. And whilst I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, your intuition about whether or not you trust someone or whether or not something's right or wrong, to me is almost like a message from your sort of evolutionary code that's designed to sort of keep you safe. Yeah, you need to sort of back it up from time to time, or you still need to test it. But ultimately, your intuition is a good innate sense of judgment. So I'd encourage people to listen to it more. And that's something that I've really taken from my career there. That's just a couple of things. But, ultimately, I can't think of myself as an individual without that experience. It's massively shaped the individual I am, the approach I take to life and the way in which I run my business. It's almost hard to divorce the two.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think you nailed two big items there, and we could go deep there, and we're going to stay on that kind of that topic of leadership, so I'm sure they'll come back. But, your team, so many people forget, they think so much of their customers, and they forget that their team is their customers, especially leaders, because you're trying to do your leadership through other people, and it becomes so huge there. And then, trusting the intuition, I just think that's so important, because as a leader, you've got to know what feels right and what's not. And I'm like you've got to know the data, you got to look at the information there, but you have to also understand what's kind of in the heart and what's kind of in the gut that comes out and really allows you to move forward. And I think this really sets it up, because what I'd be curious about now that you've seen those different styles of leadership, and now you're training and facilitating and speaking about leadership for yourself, how do you define leadership, and what do you think leaders actually do to be able to enhance their people and that intuition?
So I think of this in a kind of almost two-tier, approach. So I think of there being a sort of series of foundations, which if you don't have, you're not going to be able to, you're not going to be particularly successful if you don't have this sort of simple 6 foundations. And the 6 foundations I think of are, you've got to have a sense of self-awareness. So self-awareness is the first one. You don't get to decide whether or not you're a good leader, your team do. So how do you know that? Unless you have a sort of sense of self-awareness and you can understand the impact your behavior has on other people. The second one is an understanding of the context, and then being able to adjust your behavior to get the best out of a situation. And I'll come on to that in a second. The third is about being decisive. You've got to get comfortable with making a decision based on incomplete information. The world is a volatile and moving place. You have to get comfortable with that. There's no such thing as perfect data. And understanding that the choice to delay a decision is a decision in itself. You are choosing to burn time. The next thing you have to be able to do is create clarity. So whether that's organizational clarity, or as in, this is the vision, this is the mission that we're all working towards, or it's in every single meeting where you maybe say things like, guys, it felt like there was an action there. Who's going to do what by when? And then as the leader, you make sure that you write that down and you hold people to account. And that brings me on to the next one, which is all about accountability. You need to be willing to put yourself out there and say what you're going to do, and be comfortable holding people to account. That may mean having difficult conversations from time to time, but most of the time I find it means not forgetting what you've asked people to do. It's more of an organizational issue more than anything else. And the last one is strong relationships. You can't build a team, you can't drive performance through people or support them to achieve their very best unless you're able to build strong relationships based on trust. And those are kind of the 6 foundations for me. If you haven't got those, you're going to really struggle. And then once you go from there, and this is why I sort of briefly talked about understanding the context, I think there are varieties of almost kind of spectrums of behavior. So a lot of people will say, leadership's all about empowering people. It's about pushing decision-making to the lowest level. And most of the time, I absolutely would agree with you. But if you and me were to go for a walk and we see someone get hit by a car, you probably don't want me to turn around to you and say, Gary, do you think it's the right thing to call the ambulance? Like, technically, I've empowered you to make the decision, but you can see how my behavior as the leader in that example is totally inappropriate. And equally, like, empowering a group of people that are poorly trained or very junior or frankly don't know how to do the job is going to feel really odd. You're empowering them, but they don't know really what it is they're meant to work on. So I would argue that that's an example of where leaders need to understand the context that they're facing and then choose a way of behaving. Using that example for myself, I know that I like to have a sort of quite high level of control, and I'm kind of all right with that. But it means if I'm leading a senior team or a group of people that are relatively experienced, I kind of need to get past that and remind myself to ask them what they think. How would they approach this? How would they tackle this problem? So that I can kind of leverage the intellectual horsepower in the room and also seek their advice and guidance on how to put something together. Because people have a tendency to nurse what they birth. So if they form part of that planning process and that kind of coming up with a strategy and the way to do something, they're much more likely to. So that's basically how I think about leadership. I think it's about understanding the context that you're facing, understanding yourself and your natural way of behaving, and then choosing a way of behaving so that you get the best out of a situation. That's how I think about it.
Yeah, I think what's so important of what you said, Roderic, is understanding who are you leading. Mm-hmm. As leaders, asking that question, because like you mentioned, if you've got a very senior team, you better empower them more.
Yeah.
But if you've got that group of leaders that are brand new and they're just coming into their role, you have to kind of show them those process. And what would really help there is your 6 steps is you show them in how you use those throughout your leadership and guiding those decisions, because then that gives them a roadmap. Because what are all leaders looking for? They're looking for a roadmap. You think back to your earlier days, we brought it up with one of the first questions with the Royal Marines. You learned some of your leadership through your behaviors and through your experiences. And that really becomes true in leadership.
100%. I mean, leadership is something you do by example. It's about your behavior. It's how you act more than anything else.
Yeah. So let's go from there. So the challenge we have is in organizations, and I think you and I believe the same thing here, is a lot of times organizations fail their leaders. They really don't give them the tools and give them the capability to be able to learn. Instead, they just say do. And it's great to just do, but the problem is if they don't have that roadmap or have a framework to fall back to, then that creates a real challenge in an organization. So what do you believe organizations, how do they fail their leaders?
Well, I think there's kind of 2 elements to it. Firstly, what they generally do is promote people because they're good at something, and that reinforces the mindset of the doer. So if you are looking to promote you're promoting someone into a sales leadership role, there's a tendency to promote the guy who is the best salesman rather than necessarily someone who's the best team leader or has the best management or leadership potential. And the way I sort of think about this is that if the military did that, we'd promote all the snipers because by and large, they're pretty good soldiers. However, the role of a leader is different. Organizations promote people because they they're good at playing the instrument, and they then expect them to conduct the orchestra. And I think that's kind of how I think about it. And what they basically do is say, right, kind of get on with it. And it's sort of assumed that they know how to do it. So when they come under any form of sort of stress or pressure, what they have a tendency to do is revert to why they were promoted. So they just do more stuff. They do more of the doing, and they try and improve the performance of the team simply by almost outworking them. And I think that very few organizations sit down with their leadership teams and go, right, this is our expectations of you. This is what good leadership looks like. We're going to support you. We're going to develop you over the course of the next 12, 24 months, whatever that looks like. We're going to give you tools to do the job well. And most of the time, organizations call me in when they've got a serious cultural problem. And they've got a cultural problem because, frankly, leaders have often not necessarily been behaving in line with the organization's values, or frankly, they've just been not behaving particularly well. So I think those are the sort of two ways. It's the reason, it's the way in which they promote people. They generally promote the wrong people, and then they don't support them in terms of their development. Those are the two ways.
Yeah, and I think you're right on that, because I know just for myself, early in my career, I was in the wireless industry, and we promoted leaders that were the best salespeople. The only challenge is most of the time, great salespeople like taking care of the customers and making a sale. They don't like dealing with everything that a leader has to deal with. They want to handle the sales process. And we learned that valuable lesson, and over time changed it. But it was a valuable lesson we learned, because the problem is the people we promoted as a leader, we not only lost them as a salesperson, we also lost them as a leader. So you lose some of your top rung people that is bringing in revenue for the company, and it really hurts the organization really quick. And then I'm a firm believer with you with the no support. I think too many times we give people a title, and then we don't give them the support of how can they get there, the roadmap again that we talked about. So you talked a little bit about this, and I'm kind of curious, because to me, I'm big about culture, and I speak about that myself, and culture within an organization, which is that environment. But one of the challenges that happen in a lot of organization, and if you really want a great culture, it's about the feedback, that it has to be actively sought and well received by the recipients. But most organizations, they may say they want feedback, and they'll say it in a corporate meeting or in a team meeting, but really, once you start asking to give that feedback, then they are not willing to receive it. So where do you think some of the challenges in cultures is about getting that feedback to be able to actively seek it and then be able to receive it also as that organization?
Sure. So again, I think this is a question that relates to context and how you set up the conversation. If I was to launch into, I'm going to give you some feedback, that generally speaking, most people's reaction is to go suddenly very defensive. So I think that there are ways in which you can change the context for the conversation that has a significant impact. And this is something that people can literally practically apply this tomorrow. So the way I do it, or the way I think it's done really well, is you help the individual divorce the concepts of their personality away from their performance. And if you think about it, typically what most people have been conditioned to do is invest huge amounts of themselves in order to get a good outcome, in order to do well at something. And often this starts quite early in life. So you realize that in order to do well at your homework or your coursework, you put huge amounts of yourself into it, and it generally tends to work out all right. And what you tend to do is psychologically invest vast amounts of who you are in the work that you create and the things that you do. And often it gets people to performing to actually a really high level. The trouble is, if you want to go from very good to genuinely exceptional or world-class, you've got to learn to develop your personality away from your performance. And the way in which you do that is you kind of highlight, as I have, that there are two separate things, and you walk people through it. So after this podcast, you could say, Rod, it wasn't one of my best ones. You totally missed the mark. And I'll be like, right, obviously I'll be devastated with that. However, that's feedback on my performance. When I walk out this door and I go see my family and my dog and the kids, they don't know anything about what we've been talking about here. They don't see me do any of the work that I do. They see me for my personality and the individual I am. And that remains intact no matter how badly I do on a day facilitating a workshop or delivering a podcast. And I think that if you can create this language around the two different concepts, you can almost set a conversation up really quickly whereby you go, personality, fine. I like you. I'm happy to have a beer with you. You're a good guy. My job is to get the very best out of your performance. I have very high standards. You're not currently reaching them. This is why, bang, 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 bang. This is what I expect of you. This is what I want to see you doing differently. Are we clear? Now, that person's likely be beating themselves up about having failed to meet your expectations. So 24 hours later, you go, hey, are we okay? We had a difficult conversation there. Are you all right? You understand that my job is to fulfill your potential and help push you in that direction. I think you're the right guy. I believe you can do it. Do you have any questions, any issues? And you let them maybe talk at you, or, you let them share or vent or whatever. And then you kind of go again. But that's how to sort of manage that conversation. And when you're inviting feedback, you have to do it in such a way that the individual wants to give it to you. Sometimes they might have nothing to say, but most of the time, just say, well, what's one thing I could do to improve it slightly? Make it a really low bar. And generally speaking, people will find something to share.
Well, I can tell you, I knew I'd love this conversation because we both love leadership and we frame up things differently, but we have similar philosophies. Because just where you talk about personality and performance, I've used before where I talk about their identity. As a leader, you should never attack who they are. That's who they are as a person. And the R is the role that they play. Our job as leaders is to make them better and to get them to perform better. But the thing is, leaders normally mistake how they do it, and they attack and they don't set it up. So it seems like, wow, they don't like me. And it becomes that personal attack versus truly trying to work on the performance side. So very similar philosophies that we have. And it's so true. As a leader, what you need to be hearing is, are you working on the person's performance or improving their role as what their role is within their company? Or are you looking at more as you don't like something personally about them? Is it their personality that you're attacking? Because as leaders, that makes a big difference. Because if you feel you don't have the trust or the faith in your leader, it's hard for anyone to perform. Any of us in our personal roles we've been in, we've challenged in those ourselves.
Yeah, massively. And also, I think like what you might not like about something or someone or a situation, use your leadership capital wisely. You only have so many opportunities to make an impact. You've got to be careful with the things that you express your displeasure about or that you want to change. Otherwise, you become someone that's always complaining about things. So before you choose to have an intervention like that, think carefully about how important is this? How much of a difference is this going to make to the performance of the team? Or do you know what? Is this just a minor irritation that you have of yours that so-and-so, regularly takes days to work from home? Okay. Ultimately, you want to be focused on the performance. That's it.
Well, thanks for that. And I tell you, I think we could go on and on, Roderic, because I know we've got similar characteristics and stuff, and we could talk about leadership and have probably 4 or 5 different episodes. But because of that time, there's one more question before I go to the recharge round. I definitely want to ask you because we have similar philosophies in leadership. So I'm curious on this one, looking more at the personal side. What do you think is harder, leading at work or leading at home? Because I'll give you real quick, my philosophy is I believe we're all leaders. So it doesn't matter even if we have a title, we're a leader. But we have to realize that sometimes we have to lead at work. But also I think we have to learn that we have to lead at home. But not trying to tell you which way to go, but that's my philosophy I'll set up before you even say it.
So I think you're right. I think we all are to some extent leaders because we influence people through the example that we set. And if you're a parent, you very definitely are a leader because the way in which your children behave is a direct reflection of how you act with them and how you interact. And I'm not perfect, not by a long stretch. I don't get this right all the time. But I am conscious of it and I seek to try and be better. So in answer to your question, I actually think it's harder to lead at work than it is at home, because I think for me personally, I've got a very strong marriage, a very supportive wife who challenges me and holds me to account, but supports me in equal measure. And I think if you've got that really strong relationship, whatever you're facing at home, you'll be able to get through it. Not always as easy in the workplace.
Yeah, I agree. That it's about setting it up. But the big thing I think we want everyone to hear is you do have a leadership role in that. Even if you have a spouse that handles a lot of that, you do have a role in that you play there. Especially once you put children into the mix, it really makes it, they're looking at both examples, and they will become kind of the role model of what you are when they start leading their life. That's one thing you'll see is I've got 3 teenagers, 21, 19, and 17. So I'm seeing some of that come through each one of them. So it's very interesting to watch. Well, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with leadership. Now's a good time. Do you have a website if people want to check you out? How would they connect with you, Roderic? And then we'll come back to it at the end too, but I always give people a chance now to share if you've got a website or where they could look you up at.
Sure. So leadershipforces.com is my website. And generally speaking, I'm probably most active on LinkedIn. That's kind of a sort of social media platform that I tend to use a fair bit. I'm an open connector. I've got a very unique name, so you'll be able to find me easily. Drop me a connection request. Very happy to accept anyone.
Super. And we'll have all that information in show notes at chargepodcast.com, and we'll share it again at the very end. Roderic, I always ask each guest 6 questions, and they're kind of my framework that I frame things up with. The first one is about the mindset. And I know it's important in your everyday living, but what do you think, how do you believe your mindset affects yourself each and every day?
I think it's everything. I think really it is as simple as that. I have been to some very unpleasant parts of the world. And every day I'm thankful for the fact that I grew up in the West, and I take for granted that I have a roof over my head, clean running water, a reliable electricity source, and access to food, because most people don't have that. And I think if you realize that every day you start out from a set point that is actually pretty good, that shapes the way that you approach people and your work and the challenges that you face.
Thank you. Now, we're both kind of motivated guys. We love speaking. We love sharing information, talking about leadership, but we have those days where our energy is a little bit off. What do you do in those days? Because it's easy when we're shooting podcasts and we're speaking in front of an audience, but what do you do those days where maybe your energy is not as strong as you want it? What do you do to create that energy that you need to be able to get the things accomplished that you want to do?
So I think there are a number of practices or techniques that I apply. If I've been sat at my desk for a long period of time and I'm sort of struggling to think, I'll change my physical state. I'll go outside. Just before this podcast, I just went for 20 minutes walk with the dog. Just anything to sort of, break you out of that and sort of change the environment. I'm a big believer in the value of mindfulness. I'm listening to the Sam Harris app and sort of practice meditation. So just anything that kind of changes your state and sort of mixes it up a little bit. I found that kind of gives me a little kick of energy, even if it's just to go out and go and speak to my daughter and find out how her day went if she's got back from school, go and make a cup of tea, whatever it is, just change something and use it to sort of revitalize yourself a bit.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. How about the number one connection or relationship that has made the biggest impact on your life?
Oh, that's a difficult question. The number one connection or relationship that's had the most impact on my life. Quite possibly my father in many respects, not for the reasons most people might think. My father was married 4 times. That doesn't make him all bad. He's absolutely not all bad. But I think that he has had a significant impact on me and the way that I think in terms of wanting to do things differently. And I think whilst some difficult examples can be quite painful, they create really rich learning environments. Again, it's just about our mindset and how we think about them. So whatever your background, whatever your sort of situation, you can use that to your advantage. It would be a tragedy to repeat the mistakes of your past. So yeah, probably that I go with.
Okay, great. What advice has influenced you the most in your life?
I got some really good advice when I left the Marines, which was don't do what everyone else does. Don't go and do something like private security. Go somewhere completely different, because it will create a rich learning environment. You'll be a fish completely out of water, but if you have a good understanding of leadership from your time in the military, and then something completely different, and I spent 2 years in the nuclear industry, it's that difference that puts you in a market of one and makes you really, really valuable. So seek different experiences. Don't follow the typical career path. Go where you want to go, or where your nose takes you, or wherever you find it is interesting.
Well, now we know why the path down leadership and where you went now. So we're fortunate you decided to make that, because now we're benefiting from it, and the Chargers, my listeners, are benefit from that. Now, I know you're a reader, because we talked about that at the very get-go, but recommend a book that you really like and why you like it.
So I know this is probably one that other people have recommended. 7 Habits of Highly Successful People is brilliant. Gets you to think about your life in different terms. I think if you go through the habits and actually internalize them, think about them, they can arguably be some of the most valuable lessons that you can sort of ever learn. I'm not big into it. I'm sort of learning more and more about Stoicism. There's a guy called Donald Robertson who's kind of written an overview for Stoicism, which is which I found hugely powerful. Stoicism is kind of the baseline, or the foundation for cognitive behavioral therapy. I use it every single day. So the book is Stoicism and the Art of Happiness by Donald Robertson. That's one that your listeners might not have heard. I found it fantastic.
Excellent. We'll share those again. They'll be in show notes. So if you want to check them out, just check chargepodcast.com and we'll have all that information in show notes. Right. My last question to you, you almost made it through the final question, is in one sentence, what legacy do you want to leave the world?
I want to leave a legacy of slightly better leaders. That's it. I just don't want to change a few people by 50%. I'd like to change lots and lots of people by 10, 20%. Because if I can have an impact on them as leaders now, that has a knock-on impact to lots and lots of other people. And the simple fact is most people don't like their jobs, not because of what they do, but because of the relationship they have with their leadership. And I think that's a real shame. That's a real waste of potential. And coming from an operational excellence background, I hate waste in all forms. And that's what I'm seeking to eliminate.
Well, Roderic, you definitely have made better leaders today, because anyone that listens to this podcast with the frameworks that you've shared with us and really getting them to take a look at themselves, not just their personality, but also what do they want that performance to be for their people or for themselves, they can become a better leader themselves in each one of those areas. So I can't thank you enough for joining the Charge Podcast. Share with them, if you would, one more time, how they can reach out to you and connect with you.
Sure. So LinkedIn, Roderic Yapp, unique name. If you get the spelling right, you'll be able to find me there. I'm an open connector, and leadershipforces.com.
Roderic, we can't thank you enough for joining the Chargers today. Chargers, does that charge you up? I tell you, there's some great information in there. I'm going to go back and look through my notes, because Roderic showed several golden nuggets that you need to check out, because at the very beginning, we talked about your team becomes one of the keys that you have to look at in those interaction, really trusting your gut in your interaction, your intuition that you're having there. And there's several others there that I want to go back and really make some notes on myself. So I hope you do that. But I hope when you take a look at it, the one thing that I always tell you to do is don't just listen to the information. How now are you going to take and put it into action? And don't take everything, because you can't do that, but take one thing that we spoke about today that Roderic shared with us and then put it into action. because then it starts to become a behavior. Chargers, we're so glad you join us each and every week. Now, remember, one thing that I ask you to do each and every time, and you can help us, is keep sharing and liking the podcast. We keep growing our following. And as we grow our following, more people listen to us. We're in 50 different countries. We're getting international guests, just like Roderic is. So we love sharing that information with them. And remember, you're the key behind that. Let your best friend know, hey, I listened to the Charge podcast, and share one of the episodes with them. We would truly appreciate it. Chargers, we'll see you back here again next week. We'll have another great guest for you, and we'll have some great information for you. So go out each and every day and make it a great day. Thanks for joining us.
This podcast is ended, but your life doesn't just stop. To continue your inspiring journey, head over to chargepodcast.com and access all the tools and resources mentioned on today's show. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing with somebody who may also benefit from the advice provided. That's chargepodcast.com. Until next time, charge in business and life.